Episode 3.
The launch of global jihad. The first waves of Islamic conquest involved many massacres. During the Muslim invasion of Syria in AD 634, thousands of Christians were massacred. As Mesopotamia was conquered between AD 635 and 642, many churches and monasteries were ransacked and ministers and Christians were slain. In the conquest of Egypt in AD 640 and 641, the towns of Beinessa, Fayum, Nikayu, and Abawit were all put to the sword. The inhabitants of Cilicia were all enslaved. In Armenia, the entire population of Uqaida was wiped out. When the Muslims invaded Cyprus, they looted and pillaged the homes and churches and massacred much of the population. In North Africa, when Tripoli was captured in AD 643 by Amr, he forced all the Jews and Christians to hand over all their women and children as slaves. When Carthage was captured, it was burned to the ground and most of its inhabitants slaughtered. At the time of Muhammad's birth, Christianity had covered all of the Roman provinces of Asia, across the Caucasus to the Caspian Sea, Syria, the Holy Land, and all of North Africa across to the Atlantic Ocean. Most of the Christians in the world lived in Asia and Africa. Europe was at that time the backwater of the Church. Some of the most famous early Church fathers were from North Africa: Clement of Alexandria, Cyprian of Carthage, Tertullian of Carthage, Augustine of Hippo, and Origen of Alexandria. Other great church leaders came from the Middle East: John Chrysostom of Constantinople, Polycarp of Smyrna, and St. Paul of Tarsus. All of these areas were conquered by the sword of Islam. In the first century of Islam, 3,200 churches were destroyed or converted into mosques. The bloodiest story in history. Beginning in AD 712, the Muslim armies invaded India. Commanded by Muhammad Qasim, the Muslim armies smashed statues, demolished temples, plundered the palaces, slaughtered vast numbers of Indian men, and enslaved their women and children. It took the invaders 3 days to slaughter all the inhabitants of the port city of Dibal. At one point, the governor of Iraq, Hejaz, brought an order rebuking the armies of Muhammad Qasim for showing mercy to the infidel. "O true believers, when you encounter the unbelievers, strike off their heads. Henceforth, grant pardon to no one of the enemy, and spare none of them, or else all will consider you a weak-minded man." Hejaz demanded that all able-bodied Indian men were to be killed, and that all their sons and daughters were to be enslaved or retained as hostages. In the town of Brahminabad, Qasim massacred over 10,000 men. Ibn Warraq, in the quest for the historical Muhammad, describes the latter exploits of Mahmud of Ghazni in the 11th century as passing through India like a whirlwind, destroying, pillaging, and massacring. Warraq summarizes the effect of 17 invasions by Mahmud. Mahmud utterly ruined the prosperity of the country and performed their wonderful exploits, by which the Hindus became like atoms of dust, scattered in all directions. Describing Mathura, the holy city of Krishna, in the middle of the city there was a temple, larger and finer than the rest, which can neither be described nor painted. The Sultan was of the opinion that 200 years would have been required to build it. The Sultan gave orders that all the temples should be burnt with naphtha and fire, and levelled with the ground. The ancient cities of Varanasi, Mathura, Ujjain, Maheshwa, Jwalamukhi, and Dwarka were sacked, the populations massacred, and not one temple was left standing. Will Durant, in his The Story of Civilization, describes the Muslim invasion of India as probably the bloodiest story in history. Historians described medieval India, until the Islamic invasion, as a most rich and imaginative culture with ornate architecture, spectacular sculptures, and a complex order. The Islamic invaders broke and ruined everything beautiful they came across in Hindustan, displaying, as one Indian commentator put it, the resentment of the less developed warriors who felt intimidated in their encounter with a more refined culture. The sultans built mosques at the sites of torn-down Hindu temples, and many Hindus were sold into slavery. At Somnath, 50,000 Hindus were slaughtered on Mahmud's orders. The northwestern region of India is called the Hindu Kush, the slaughter of the Hindu, as a reminder of the vast number of Hindu slaves who died whilst being marched across the Afghan mountains to the Muslim markets in Central Asia. The Buddhists were also targeted for destruction, and in AD 1193, Muhammad Khilji burnt to the ground their famous library. With the Muslim destruction of the Buddhist stronghold in Bihar, the survivors retreated into Nepal and Tibet. Some escaped to the south of the subcontinent. Some of the last remaining monuments to the Buddhist culture, 4 statues of Buddha, were destroyed by the Taliban in Afghanistan in March 2001. In AD 1351, Firuz Shah commanded all Hindus to be killed and all Hindu temples to be destroyed. On the site of many of the razed temples, he built mosques. On the 24th of February 1568, after the Battle of Chittod, the Mughal Emperor Akbar ordered the 30,000 captured Hindus to be executed. Akbar is remembered by historians as one of the most tolerant of the Muslim rulers of India. In fact, Akbar incorporated numerous Hindu and Zoroastrian festivals and practices and was condemned as an apostate. Shah Jahan is remembered as the builder of the Taj Mahal. He was the 5th Mughal emperor and a grandson of Akbar. What few Westerners know is that the builder of the Taj Mahal launched 48 military campaigns against non-Muslims in just 30 years. In AD 1628, he killed all his male relatives, except one who escaped to Persia. Shah Jahan had 5,000 concubines in his harem, but still indulged in incestuous sex with his daughters Shamani and Jahanara. In just one town, Benares, Jahan destroyed 76 Hindu temples. He also demolished Christian churches in Agra and Lahore. When he captured Hue, a Portuguese enclave near Calcutta, he had 10,000 inhabitants blown up with powder, drowned in water, or burned by fire. Another 4,000 were enslaved and offered Islam or death. Those who refused to convert were killed. Unfinished business. Sergei Trifkovich, in The Sword of the Prophet, observes that the massacres perpetrated by Muslims in India are unparalleled in history, bigger in sheer numbers than the Holocaust or the massacre of the Armenians by the Turks, more extensive even than the slaughter of the South American native populations by the invading Spanish and Portuguese. They are insufficiently known in the outside world. However, Gandhi and Nehru went around encrusting even thicker coats of whitewash so that they could pretend a facade of Hindu and Muslim unity against British colonial rule. After independence, Marxist Indian writers, blinded by their distorting ideology, repeated the big lie about the Muslim record. Militant Islam sees India as unfinished business, and it remains high on the agenda of oil-rich Muslim countries such as Saudi Arabia, which are spending millions every year trying to convert Hindus to Islam. Unfortunately, the table has been turned lately. Hindus are slaughtering Muslims. Spain under the Moors. On the Western Front, Muslim armies conquered all of North Africa, Spain, and even parts of southern France. But at the Battle of Tours, AD 732, the Franks, under the leadership of Charles Martel, turned the tide and drove the Muslim armies out of France. The Muslims withdrew behind the Pyrenees mountain range, which separated France from Spain. Spain under the Muslim Moors was hardly the jewel of Islamic tolerance that it is often purported to be. In AD 920, Caliph Abd er-Rahman III put the inhabitants of Muez to the sword. In AD 923, he entered Pamplona and destroyed its cathedral. Moorish Spain by R. Fletcher records the destruction of Córdoba, Zaragoza, and Mérida, where all adult males were executed and all women and children enslaved. The surrender of Granada in 1492 marked the final defeat of the Moors and the liberation of Spain from 800 years of Muslim occupation. In AD 1066, all the Jews of Granada were slaughtered. In AD 1126, the Christians of Granada were deported to Morocco. As Fletcher observes, in Moorish Spain, oppression or anarchy was the rule. Good order and civilized behavior a fondly remembered exception. Much has been made by Muslim apologists of the freedom of religion and toleration for Christians as protected persons. In fact, freedom of religion in Muslim areas only meant the freedom of Christians and Jews to convert to Islam, never the other way around. Christians and Jews were encouraged to convert to Islam, but Muslims were forbidden, on pain of death, to change their Islamic religion. The Pact of Umar. The Pact of Umar guided the Islamic policy towards Christians. Aside from being forced to pay jizya, a crippling poll tax, and haraj, land tax to the Muslims, the Christians were forbidden to carry weapons, share their faith with Muslims, or even display the cross in public. The Pact of Umar, which all conquered Christians were forced to solemnly declare, included, "We shall not build in our cities or in their vicinities any new monasteries, churches. We shall not restore, by night or by day, any of them that have fallen into ruin or which have located in the Muslim quarters. We shall keep our gates wide open for the passers-by and travellers. We shall provide 3 days' food and lodging to any Muslims who pass our way. We shall not hold public religious ceremonies. We shall not seek to proselytize anyone. We shall not prevent any of our kin from embracing Islam if they so desire. We shall show deference to the Muslims and shall rise from our seats when they wish to sit down. We shall not ride on saddles. We shall not wear swords or bear weapons of any kind, or ever carry them with us. We shall not sell wines. We shall clip the forelocks of our heads. We shall not display our crosses or our books anywhere in the Muslims' thoroughfares or in their marketplaces. We shall not raise our voices when reciting the service in our churches, nor when in the presence of Muslims. Neither shall we raise our voices in our funeral processions. We shall not build our houses higher than theirs." Millions of Christians for over 13 centuries have suffered under this oppression, and millions still do. Compare how little freedom Christians have in Muslim lands with how much freedom Muslims enjoy in Christian lands. The Pact of Umar was no pact at all, but an unconditional surrender. Umar warned the Christians that disobedience to this pact meant death. Anyone who violates such terms will be unprotected, and it will be permissible for the Muslims to treat them as rebels or dissenters. Namely, it is permissible to kill them. The House of War. Before the Crusades began, the prominent Islamic scholar Abu Ala al-Mawardi presented a formal blueprint for Islamic government. It reiterated the division of the world into the House of Islam, where Sharia law has been enforced, and the House of War, which is the rest of the world. According to al-Mawardi, the House of Islam is in a permanent state of war with all others. Peace can only come with the completion of global conquest. When the Muslims are a minority community, they need temporarily to adopt a peaceful attitude to deceive their neighbors. But the final objective is Dar al-Islam, where Muslims rule and infidels are forcibly converted or massacred. Al-Mawardi made it clear that jihad was an obligation for all Muslims. Muslims could use tactical ceasefires, but could never consider the abandonment of jihad until all unbelievers had been subjugated. Under Sharia law, a non-Muslim's testimony is not admissible against a Muslim's. Non-Muslims could not be employed in any position of superiority over a Muslim. No non-Muslim should ever hold a position in which he can have power over a Muslim. Islam turned its boundary with the outside world into a perpetual war zone. Muslim armies crossed the Pyrenees, promising to stable their horses in St. Peter's at Rome. However, exactly a century after the Prophet's death, Charles Martel, the Hammer, defeated the Muslims at the Battle of Tours in AD 732. Churches demolished, pilgrims persecuted. In AD 1009, Caliph Hakem of Egypt ordered the destruction of the Holy Sepulchre and all Christian places of worship in Jerusalem. From this point on, the Christians were persecuted even more cruelly than in the previous years of Muslim rule. In AD 1065, thousands of Christian pilgrims under the leadership of Bishop Gunter were attacked by Muslims in violation of the early agreements of safe passage. The rise of the Seljuk Turks made the position of the Christian pilgrims even more tenuous and desperate. The Christian Byzantine Empire had reconquered much of Syria and Palestine, including Antioch in AD 969. However, the Seljuk Turks invaded much of these lands and conquered Christian Armenia and most of Asia Minor. In AD 1070, they took Jerusalem, and in AD 1071, they defeated the Greek Emperor Diogenes at Manzikert. Antioch fell to the Turks in AD 1084, and by AD 1092, all the Christian parishes in Asia lay under the control of the Muslims. The Byzantines appealed to the West for help to recover their lands from the onslaughts of Islam. The Crusades are launched. The result was on 27th of November AD 1095, the Pope called upon the Knights of Europe to go forth and rescue the Holy Sepulchre and retake the Holy Land. With cries of Deus hoc vult, God wills it, thousands of knights pledged themselves to liberate the Holy Land from Islam. It is interesting that many who excuse the atrocities of Islamic jihad in terms of the standards of the Middle Ages apply a double standard by condemning the Christian Crusades, which were, after all, only a reaction to centuries of Islamic jihad. Many Christians condemn the Crusades as completely against the spirit of Christ. Certainly, the word crusade does not appear in the Bible, and there are no teachings of Christ or the apostles commanding Christians to be involved in such crusades. However, very few people have any understanding of what was actually involved in the Crusades. Antioch liberated. The facts are that by May AD 1097, the armies of the First Crusade were assembled. On the 1st of July AD 1097, the Crusaders defeated the Turks at the Battle of Dorylaeum. Constantly harassed by a relentless enemy suffering from the stifling heat under the weight of their armour, the Crusaders advanced through Asia Minor. On the 20th of October AD 1097, they laid siege to the fortified city of Antioch. On the 3rd of June AD 1098, the Crusaders stormed Antioch and captured it. By then, plague, famine, and wounds had decimated their ranks, and recuperation and resupply were necessary. To Jerusalem. By April AD 1099, the Crusader army was on the march again to Jerusalem. They marched through scorched earth, where all the trees, even fruit trees, had been chopped down, wells poisoned to deny the Crusaders shade, food, and water. The Crusaders also started to meet Christians and Jews who had been evicted from Jerusalem by the Muslim occupiers. These destitute refugees had lost everything and were now struggling to find water, shelter, and food in a devastated area. When the Crusaders reached the walls of Jerusalem, they offered the occupiers terms of surrender. When the Muslim garrison responded with blasphemous comments and actions, including urinating on icons and crucifixes of Christ, the Crusaders rose in indignation and fought for the honor of their King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The Crusaders take Jerusalem. On the 15th of July AD 1099, during an eclipse of the sun, the Crusaders stormed the gates of Jerusalem and overwhelmed the vigorous Muslim defences. The Crusaders gave no quarter and slew the entire garrison, killed these Saracens who had desecrated the holy places. In AD 1112, with the aid of the Norwegians and the support of the Genoese, Pisan, and Venetian fleets, the Crusaders began the conquest of the ports of Syria. With the fall of Tyre in AD 1124, this was completed. By the beginning of the 12th century, the Crusaders controlled an unbroken but thin belt of territory consisting of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Countship of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the Countship of Edessa. The focus of the Crusaders was on the holy places and the ports, so they did not attempt to develop strategic depth or create any viable economic or demographic base for the new Christian states. The Crusader territory was long, thin, and vulnerable to attack. To defend these outposts, the Crusaders created new religious orders of knights to provide hospitality for pilgrims and to defend the holy places from the Muslims. Saladin and Richard the Lion-Hearted. In AD 1144, the Muslims counter-attacked and conquered the Principality of Edessa. Damascus fell in AD 1154. Then in AD 1169, a Kurdish prince, Saladin, succeeded his uncle as the Grand Vizier of Egypt. In AD 1171, he helped overthrow the Shiite Fatimid dynasty. Soon Saladin's armies were threatening the Kingdom of Jerusalem from all sides. On the 4th of July AD 1187, Saladin's army defeated the Christians on the shores of Lake Tiberias. He entered Jerusalem on the 17th of September. The Christians still held the ports of Tyre, Antioch, and Tripoli. King Richard I of England returned from the Third Crusade to an enthusiastic welcome. When the people in Europe heard of the fall of Jerusalem, there was much outrage. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, King Philip of France, and Richard the Lion-Hearted, King of England, were the leaders of this Third Crusade. Acre surrendered to Richard on the 13th of July AD 1191. Numerous battles pitted Richard against Saladin. Saladin respected his foes as brave warriors, and a treaty was secured guaranteeing safe access for Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem and other holy places. The end of the Crusades. After the death of Saladin, Jerusalem was again conquered by the Crusaders in AD 1229. But in AD 1244, the city fell again to the Muslims. Al-Malik al-Zahir destroyed the Church of the Nativity in Nazareth and captured Caesarea. Caesarea capitulated under the condition that its 2,000 knights would be spared. However, once the Muslims gained access to the city, they murdered them all. When Antioch finally fell to the Muslims, 16,000 Christians were executed and 100,000 were said to be sold into slavery. By the end of the 13th century, the last Crusader remnants in Palestine and Syria were wiped out. That may have been the end of the Crusades, but it was by no means the end of jihad. Dynasties, decadence, and decline.
The first caliphs had ruled from Mecca.
The Umayyad dynasty ruled from Damascus for about 90 years. In AD 749, all the members of the Umayyad family were murdered, except for Abd al-Rahman, who fled to Spain and founded the independent Umayyad Caliphate there. By AD 711, Islam had spread all over North Africa and Spain, and by AD 718, it was beginning to overrun southern France. Muslim historians note that at this time a general spiritual and moral decline began to set in. The Abbasid dynasty ruled the Muslim world from AD 750 to AD 1258. Baghdad became the new capital of Islam. Initially a small village, Baghdad was built by slave labor into a great city with palaces, mosques, and impressive government buildings. This empire was destroyed by Genghis Khan in the 13th century. The Ottoman Empire was founded by Emir Osman I in AD 1301. After the massacre of the last Abbasid Khalifa and all his relatives, Turks from near the Caspian Sea began to build a new Islamic empire on the ruins of the declining Byzantine Empire.
Eventually, these Ottoman caliphs were ruling the whole of North Africa, the Near East India, and the Balkans of southeastern Europe.
The fall of Constantinople. Muslim scholars note that the Abbasid dynasty drowned in decadence and luxury, and had become deficient in energy and reluctant to rally in defense. Under Mehmet II, the Turks conquered the great Byzantine capital, Constantinople. On the 29th of May, AD 1453, the sparse and woefully outnumbered garrison of Constantinople put up a brave but futile defense and were overwhelmed by the waves of Turkish invaders. The pillaging and looting went on for days. Tens of thousands of civilians were slaughtered in the streets. Turkish soldiers fought over boys and young women. The blood ran in rivers down the steep streets from the heights of the Petra towards the Golden Horn. The imperial palace was looted and its treasures carried off. Priceless libraries and icons were burnt, including the Hodigitria, the holiest icon in all of Byzantine, which was of Mary, believed to have been painted by St. Luke himself. Sir Stephen Runciman, in his book The Fall of Constantinople, 1453, described the scene when the Turks burst into the greatest Christian church in the world at that time, the Hagia Sophia. The worshippers were trapped. A few of the ancients and infirmed were killed on the spot, but most of them were tied or chained together. Many of the lovely maidens and youths and many of the richer-clad nobles were almost torn to death as their captors quarrelled over them. The priests went on praying at the altar until they too were taken. The inhabitants were carried off along with their possessions. Anyone who collapsed from frailty was slaughtered, together with a number of infants who were held to be of no value. Byzantine was now half in ruins, empty and deserted and blackened as though by fire, and strangely silent. Wherever the Turks had been, there was desolation. Churches had been desecrated and stripped. Houses were no longer habitable, and shops and stores battered and bare. The Sultan himself, as he rode through the streets, had been moved to tears. Many of the Eastern Orthodox Christians could not understand why no armies from the West had come to assist in the defense of Constantinople. It seemed that since the great schism of 1054 between the Latin Roman Catholic Church of the West and the Greek Orthodox Church of the East, the Western Catholics hated their Greek brothers more than they feared the Islamic invaders. The Blood Levy. Soon the Turks were occupying southeastern Europe and threatening even the heartland of Europe, besieging the gates of Vienna itself in 1529. The Turkish Muslims even outdid the Arabian oppression of the Christians. In addition to the crippling jizya tribute tax, the Turks demanded an annual blood levy of Christian boys in peacetime. 1 out of every 5 Christian boys was forcibly recruited into the Sultan's armies. This devshirm was introduced by Sultan Orkan in the 14th century. Ibn Warraq describes the scene. On a fixed date, all the fathers were ordered to appear with their children in the public square. The recruiting agents chose the most sturdy and handsome children in the presence of a Muslim judge. Any father who shirked his duty to provide children was severely punished. This system was open to all kinds of abuse. The recruiting agents often took more than the prescribed number of children and sold the surplus back to their parents. For 3 centuries, beginning in 1350, the Muslim occupiers led military expeditions into Christian villages to kidnap Christian boys for training as the Sultan's Janissaries. This Turkish blood levy upon the Christians has left such a deep scar on the collective memory of Balkan Christians, especially the Serbs and Bulgarians, that it continues to contribute to the hostilities of Bosnia and Kosovo. The Turkish invasions destroyed the dynamic and creative Christian civilizations of Byzantine, Serbia, and Bulgaria. A 1410 panel depicting the struggle between the Christians and the Moors in Spain. The tide turns. In 1492, the Spaniards finally succeeded in freeing Spain from the centuries of Muslim occupation with the fall of Granada. Cyprus fell in 1571 after a heroic defense by 5,000 Greek and Italian Christians who killed 6 times their number of Turkish aggressors. Unspeakable cruelties and mutilations were perpetrated on the captured Christian prisoners by the Turks. The tide of Islamic expansionism was then turned at the Battle of Lepanto on the 7th of October 1571, when the Christian fleet under Don John of Austria, with 208 warships, met the Turkish fleet of 230 warships. Hand-to-hand combat ensued as the Austrians flowed onto the Turkish vessels. Over 30,000 Turks were killed and 15,000 taken prisoner. It was described as one of the most decisive turning points in history. When the Turks were later defeated outside the gates of Vienna, this ended the overt threat to Central Europe. Corruption and cruelty. Soon the Ottoman Empire began to decline into corruption and degeneracy. When Sultan Murad III died in AD 1595, his son Muhammad had his 19 brothers murdered to prevent them from claiming his throne. He also had 7 of his father's pregnant concubines sewn into sacks and thrown into the river. Many of his nephews were incarcerated in the cage. Sultan Ibrahim threw his Grand Vizier into a cistern. One morning, after an orgy, Ibrahim had all 300 women of his harem put into sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus. Only one survived by being picked up by a ship bound for France. When Ibrahim was finally assassinated, the Ottoman Empire was torn apart by corruption, nepotism, inefficiency, misrule, and power struggles. A new wave of Muslim massacres. In the early 19th century, after the Ottoman Empire suffered defeats at the hands of Russia and Austria, and as the Greeks and Serbs mounted successful wars of national liberation, Sultan Mahmud II decided to massacre all the Janissaries. The reforms and westernization of state institutions, however, were accompanied by escalating persecution of Christians. Despite the adoption of a Western-style constitution in 1839 to placate the European powers, the last century of Ottoman rule witnessed the most thorough and complete destruction of Christian communities throughout the Middle East, Asia Minor, the Caucasus, and the Balkans. In 1822, the entire population of the island of Chios, tens of thousands of people, were massacred or enslaved. In 1823, 8,750 Christians were slaughtered by the Turks at Missolonghi. Thousands of Assyrian Christians were murdered in the province of Mosul in 1850. In 1860, over 12,000 Christians were slaughtered in Lebanon. In 1876, 14,700 Bulgarians were murdered by the Turks. At the town of Bateo, out of 7,000 inhabitants, 5,000 were put to the sword. The Scandalous Alliance. The reports of these and other routine atrocities by the Ottoman Turks were generally suppressed by the British government of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who promoted an alliance with Turkey against Russia. Gladstone opposed the Turkophile policies of Disraeli in these words: "He is not such a Turk as I thought. What he hates is Christian liberty and reconstruction." What Gladstone observed 125 years ago could easily be applied to the foreign policies of many Western governments today. The Islamophilia in the West is not so much love of the Turk, but hatred of Christianity. As Sergei Trifkovich, in The Sword of the Prophet, observes, the great Western powers, the heirs of those who had looted Constantinople in the Crusades and refused to help when the Turks were breaking through the walls with a cannon built by a Hungarian Catholic, who forced the last emperors to forswear their Orthodox faith at the Council of Florence as the price of Western help that never came. Those same Western powers, and Great Britain in particular, actually supported the Turkish subjugation of Christian Europeans on the grounds that the Mohammedan Empire was a stabilizing force and a counterweight against Austria and Russia. The scandalous alliance with Turkey against Russia in the Crimean War reflected a pernicious frame of mind that has manifested itself more recently in the overt, covert, or de facto support of certain Western powers for the Muslim side in Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Chechnya, Cyprus, Sudan, East Timor, and Kashmir. The Forgotten Holocaust. The Turks slaughtered over 200,000 Armenian Christians in Bayazid, 1877, Alashgird, 1879, Sassun, 1894, Constantinople, 1896, Adana, 1909, and Armenia, 1895 to 1896. And in 1915, the Turks massacred more than 1 million Armenian Christians, according to the International Association of Genocide Scholars, or IAGS. Passage to Ararat, by Michael J. Allen, describes how along the road to Adana, Turkish women were given daggers to stab dying Armenians to gain credit in the eyes of Allah for having killed a Christian. In 1881, the Turks slaughtered the Christians in Alexandria. In 1915 to 1916, over 100,000 Maronite Christians in Lebanon and Syria were murdered. It is no wonder that the British Prime Minister Gladstone described the Muslim Turks as, "They were, upon the whole, from the black day when they first entered Europe, the one great anti-human specimen of humanity. Wherever they went, a broad line of blood marked the track behind them, and as far as their dominion reached, civilization disappeared from view. They represented everywhere government by force, as opposed to government by law." Slaughter in Smyrna. Even as the Ottoman Empire crumbled and was replaced by the new Republic of Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the ancient city of Smyrna, with its 300,000 Christian population, was destroyed. The burning of Smyrna and the massacre of its Christian population marked the end of Greek civilization in Asia Minor. On the eve of its destruction, Smyrna was a bustling port and a vibrant commercial center. The seafront promenade was a popular tourist destination. On the 9th of September 1922, the Turkish mob, organized and mobilized by the Turkish army under the command of Mustafa Kemal, attacked the Greek Orthodox Metropolitan Chrysostomos. The mob ripped his eyes out and dragged him by the beard, bleeding through the streets, beating and kicking him. Every now and then, when he had the strength to do it, he would raise his right hand and bless his persecutors, repeating, "Father, forgive them." One Turk became so infuriated at this that he cut off the Metropolitan's hand with his sword. Father Chrysostomos was hacked to pieces by the angry mob. The burning of Smyrna began on the 13th of September. The inhabitants were trapped between the flames on the one side and the Turkish bayonets on the other. The Curse of Neutrality. Incredibly, English, American, Italian, and French ships anchored in Smyrna's harbour were ordered to maintain neutrality. Some of the eyewitnesses described the scene. The pitiful throng, huddled together, sometimes screaming for help, but mostly waiting in a silent panic beyond hope, didn't budge for days. Typhoid reduced their numbers, but there was no way to dispose of the dead. Occasionally a person would swim from the dock to one of the anchored ships and try to climb the ropes and chains only to be driven off. On the American battleships, the musicians on board were ordered to play as loudly as they could to drown out the screams of the pleading swimmers. The English poured boiling water down on the unfortunate who reached their vessel. The harbour was so clogged with corpses that the officers of the foreign battleships were often late to their dinner appointments because bodies would get entangled in the propellers of their launches. A cluster of women's heads bound together like coconuts by their long hair floated down a river toward the harbour. An unmitigated cultural disaster. That was the end of Christianity in Turkey, as Trikovich observes. At the very time that Europe achieved its military and geopolitical advantage, the moral and religious decline that culminated in the auto-genocides of 1914 and 1939 had become evident. Having found in their grasp places their Crusader predecessors had only dreamed of reclaiming, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, effete and demoralized European governments made no effort to re-Christianize them, and within a few decades neatly abandoned them. The moral disarmament of contemporary post-Christian Europe is now nearly universal. After World War I, with the installation of nominally pro-Western governments in many Muslim countries fashioned from the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire, the West seemed to have convinced itself of the existence of benign Islam. Entire peoples have been obliterated in the Middle East. The Nestorians, the Chaldeans, and other Christian communities were wiped out. As late as 1955, Istanbul's Christians suffered what one reporter called the worst race riot in Europe. It is no wonder that William Muir, 1819 to 1905, one of the greatest Orientalists of all times, concluded at the end of a long and distinguished career, "The sword of Mohammed and the Quran are the most fatal enemies of civilization, liberty, and truth which the world has yet known, an unmitigated cultural disaster parading as God's will." Intellectual dishonesty. The persecution of Christians by Muslims has become a forbidden subject in Western circles. 13 centuries of religious discrimination and persecution, causing the suffering, oppression, murder, and enslavement of countless millions, have been buried under a thick whitewash of myths of Islamic tolerance. The deceit, cowardice, and silence by all too many Western journalists and academics continue to facilitate the religious discrimination and persecution of radical Islam to this day. The intellectual dishonesty of those Westerners who engage in academic gymnastics to justify the invasion of other people's lands, the looting, pillaging, raping, murdering, and enslaving of whole peoples needs to be exposed. The hypocrisy of those who justify the military expansion of Muslims, but condemn those who inflicted defeat upon these Islamic invaders, needs to be challenged. The fiction that jihad has never been aggressive, but defensive, should be dismissed with the contempt that such deception deserves. When Islam defines a refusal to submit to Sharia law under Islam as aggression, and when they define peace as submission to Islam, then we must know that we are not talking the same language. Sharia in Saudi. For an up-to-date 21st century glimpse of Islam, look at Saudi Arabia. The U.S. State Department report on human rights in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in AD 2000 gives some indication of what is in store for those countries in Europe and Africa if Islam achieves a majority and enforces Sharia law. Freedom of religion does not exist. Islam is the official religion, and all citizens must be Muslims. Neither the government nor society, in general, accepts the concept of the separation of religion and state. and such separation does not exist. Under Sharia, conversion by a Muslim to another religion is considered apostasy. Public apostasy is a crime punishable by death if the accused does not recant. Islamic religious education is mandatory in public schools at all levels. All children receive religious instruction. Citizens do not have the right to change their government. There is legal and systematic discrimination based on sex and religion. The Saudi Religious Police, the Committee to Promote Virtue and Prevent Vice, routinely intimidates, abuses and detains citizens and foreigners. The authorities flog, amputate and execute by beheading and stoning or firing squad. A Saudi Arabian court even ordered that the eye of an Egyptian man be removed as a punishment. Most trials are closed, and defendants usually appear without an attorney before a judge who determines their guilt or innocence according to the Sharia. Banners and adverts offer financial rewards to Saudis who inform on fellow Saudis who attend a Christian meeting or who have a Bible. Although Saudi Arabia has paid for the construction of over 1,000 mosques in the United States and several thousands in other parts of the world, no churches or synagogues are allowed in Saudi Arabia. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John chapter 8, verse 32.
Thank you for listening to episode 3 of Show the House to the House. You can now listen to episode 4 on the same channel.